Alright, hello, welcome back everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. And if you want access to the graphs in this video, then those and all kinds of other hundreds of other graphs across all kinds of different subjects and data are available in the Drive folder linked in the description. So time for the monthly oil production levels update for non-OPEC countries. Starting off with Angola, who actually used to be an OPEC member, but left about a year and a half ago. The same reason as most of the other members who left over the course of time, as they didn't really want to keep being limited to keep playing along with all the basically permanent production cut regimes. They peaked at 2 million barrels per day a while ago and have since declined down close to 1, and they've held off from declining further for a little bit, adding modest new offshore fields here and there, but they can't keep that up forever, and they have been inching closer to 1, this time having an abrupt drop further down to just above it at 1.01 million barrels per day. Argentina was up in the 800,000s a couple decades ago, declined in conventional production down to about 400,000, and then in the later 2010s, it started fracking in the Vaca Muerta shale, which has brought them back up into the 800,000s, heading towards the mid 800,000s, now being somewhere around 830. Australia used to be up in the 800s at their peak, and they have since declined with a few recovery periods here and there with some brief additions, but overall are now down all the way into the mid 200,000s, this time coming in at 261. Azerbaijan peaked at about 1.1 million barrels per day, and over the last decade and a half or 2 decades has declined down now into the upper 500,000s, down to about half of what they once were, this time coming in at a flat 570. Brazil has, as of this data release, hit 4 million barrels per day. They, capacity-wise, had already gotten up to 4.2 in terms of what they potentially could produce with all the new additional fields off their southeastern coast that they had added, but a lot of their older ones offshore were shut down for prolonged maintenance. A lot of that work is now done, so almost everything is online at the present moment, putting them up above 4 million barrels per day. Canada, meanwhile, has just returned to 5 million barrels per day, where they had gotten just a bit above that before those massive wildfires earlier in the summer forced them to shut down a lot of capacity for a couple months. They have returned to just about 5 million barrels per day. China continuing to hold out in the low fours, continuing to just hold on before slipping in to actual terminal decline, this time coming in at 4.35. Colombia had its second peak at 1 million barrels per day and has since fallen down in stair steps, basically, down now seeming to be going through another one, as they were hanging out in the upper 700s, but they seem to be stepping down through the 700s and might end up closer to 700 or so, perhaps, at the bottom of this next step. Currently, they're at 750, and their export margin is slipping as their domestic consumption, their own oil demand, is now on average about 500,000 barrels per day themselves. Ecuador, on their terminal decline after hitting a final peak at 550,000 and being a much smaller nation and having basically already gone through all the territory they have to explore. So they're on their way down and are now down in the 460s at 464,000, also shrinking their exports gradually over time as their demand, their domestic consumption, now averages above 300,000 barrels per day themselves. So that window is shrinking. Egypt was once up close to a million, but declined down towards 600,000, from which they have then continued going down in stair-step fashion, similar to Colombia's decline, now having gone through another stair-step down from the mid 500s to it seems like around 500, but they might go lower. We'll have to see. This time they came in once again at 507,000 barrels per day. Ghana was once up at 214 at the highest. However, they declined down towards 150, but then some enhanced recovery operations brought them back up to 190, from which they have resumed declining and are now back down to 184. Guyana, now with their fourth field activated, is up around 900,000 barrels per day or so. Indonesia had declined from its once plateau up in the 1.5 million barrel per day range decades ago down to the 580,000s. However, they brought one new modest field online recently that brought them back up to about 610, but they're obviously just going to keep going down from that point now. Kazakhstan recently, earlier this year, or at the start of the year, finally breached above 2 million barrels per day, and they should be capable of getting up to about 2.6 with a few more years, from which they can probably hold that for a little bit before declining. This time in particular, after dropping a few tens of thousands previously, they came back up to a flat 2.2 million barrels per day. Malaysia still hanging out a bit under 500,000 in the upper 400,000s, this time coming in at 485,000. Mexico, having declined from its peak of 3.5 million barrels per day, has been hanging out in the upper ones area. And as I said before, it's going to stay here for the remainder of the 2020s between 1.5 or 1.6 and a bit under 2, as Mexico does have two new large offshore fields that will be getting activated in the next couple of years, each of which should give a 100,000 or 200,000 barrel per day production boost, from which Mexico will then obviously resume declining. This time they came in at 1.73 million barrels per day. Norway recently, a few weeks ago, activated their new Arctic field up offshore of the northern reach of the country, and that brought them up to 2.2 million barrels per day. And latest was maintenance at some other fields had them drop down by 60,000, so that will put them down to 2.14 million barrels per day now. Oman continuing to hold a bit under 1 million, so they're still down there, this time at 991,000. Qatar, having left OPEC a while ago as they didn't want to be suppressed anymore, and they brought themselves up to the 1.5 or a bit under 1.5 range that they wanted, is continuing to hold around 1.3 or so, coming in once again at 1.32, although there has probably been some actual fluctuation within there, but they're one of the countries that gives me a bit of trouble getting direct actual numbers. Another country that gives me trouble, one of the ones who's given me the most trouble across all different kinds of data, Russia, the one who has gradually, whether it be oil and gas, energy of any kind, demographics and population, has declared each type of data one by one to be classified, and thus no longer actually releases any data. So, in every direction across every different type of data, I now have to look at multiple different things and do all kinds of backwards backflips in math to try to get to it. And so, we're at a point now where we're going to have to be dealing with approximations. I apologize for that, but that's not something I have control over anymore. Russia was up to about 11 million barrels per day pre-COVID. They dropped during the COVID demand crash, recovered just up until invading Ukraine, and then after invading Ukraine, they had to cut to 10 immediately because of instantaneous customer absence from Europe. And then after that, after a bit of time passed, since the outside oil majors who had done most of the work recovering their production post Soviet collapse and were responsible for doing especially a lot of the new Arctic and super permafrost stuff. Russia has ended up, as expected, not really able to hold it all together. And although they gave different excuses as for why they kept going down over time, they as of this year, stopped actually giving any reasons and just kept going down, all the way now down to around 8.7 or 8.6. Thailand once held a plateau in the mid 200,000s for a while, then has declined down to the mid 100s and keeps falling below the arbitrary 150,000 threshold that I set for whether your country gets included on this list or not, and every now and then they pop back above it. This time they popped back above it again at 153,000 barrels per day. Turkmenistan peaked in the mid 200s, has since declined down to around 190 at 191. The UK, long fallen from its 3 million barrel per day North Sea heights, has declined all the way down to only the 600,000s, this time coming in at 644, while its domestic oil consumption is more than twice that at 1.5 million barrels per day. The US peaked at 13.6 or a bit above 13.6. I think the exact second decimal was 13.63 million barrels per day. And then a couple months into this year, it touched 13.6 again. But since then, it had been going down. And then when the price collapse happened in April, that has stuck around since then. The US drilling rig count collapsed because shale requires a minimum threshold price of $65 per barrel, and thus US production, since it's predominantly shale now, has been falling since then, and it had fallen down under 13.3 down to close to 13.2 and a half. But then we got a sudden jump back upwards to 13.4 from most likely the larger of the two remaining offshore fields in the Gulf that were due to come online. There is one more that should be coming online that will give a sudden, I think, 80,000 barrel per day boost or maybe 100. And there is also a large new oil field development back up home in Alaska that should be an 80,000 barrel per day jump when that comes online, I think next year, but I'm not positive on the schedule for that one. But for this time, US came in back up at 13.4 since that one activated or switched on a few weeks ago. Vietnam held a plateau in the mid 300,000s for a couple decades, but since has slipped down to the mid 100s, this time coming in at 165,000. Meanwhile, their domestic consumption in present day has now exceeded 700,000 barrels per day. And that's the end of the list this time. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. There's the link to the drive folder I mentioned down below that has these graphs and all kinds of other graphs that are free to access. Any financial support helps with maintaining those as well. There's links to my photography and my blue sky, and one in the top pinned comment to my cat's YouTube channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.